Welcome to this Considered Opinions podcast.
I'm Dougal.
And I'm Celia. Thank you for joining us. Today we're going to be discussing materialism, where it came from, how it developed, and what sort of influence it has on our lives today. Madonna once sang, "We are living in a material world, and I am a material girl." Is that true? Are we living in a material world?
Certainly, we live in a world that is dominated by materialism as a philosophy. The irony there is that philosophy is immaterial. So, right from the get-go, it's a self-defeating proposition. But that hasn't stopped materialism from developing to the point that we have today where someone like Yuval Harari can stand up and say, we can create life. That sort of hubris is where materialism has ultimately led us.
So materialism is a philosophy and it underpins a lot of the ideas and social and cultural mores of our society.
Correct. And a lot of it we're not necessarily aware of either. There's an old saying that anyone who says that they don't have a worldview is basically a walking billboard for some dead philosopher. Now, materialism as a philosophy, a lot of people will link it to the Enlightenment. So it's ideas where you're assuming that only the material world exists and that things of a spiritual nature are dismissed as basically non-existent.
Or superstition. As human beings, we are spiritual as well as material beings. And so we have to have a belief system as the framework that we can build our lives around.
Correct.
And the prevalent or predominant belief system or philosophy that we have
is materialism.
Which says that we don't have a spiritual aspect and belief system. We're simply animals.
You can see where that might lead to issues, because if you are a spiritual being but you have a philosophy that denies your very nature, then the likelihood is that there's going to be some anxieties that develop. You're going to have potentially some mental health issues in your society, because essentially people are living a philosophy that doesn't match the reality they see around them. So you end up living two lives. There's that which you admit consciously, and there is that which you live, which is kind of unspoken. And I should probably go back to the start of materialism. I go back to the famous quote of René Descartes, who it was actually his Proof of God where he said this, but the line is, "I think, therefore I am." So what he's doing here is he's trying to understand, how do I know what I know? How can I trust what I know? And what he fell back on is simply his mental cognition. He fell back on a materialistic explanation. I have a brain, I can use it, I can think, therefore there's my starting point. The issue with this proposition is that the way you start is the way that you will continue. If you start with a self-centered proposition, your whole outlook, your whole framework will continue to be self-centered. And eventually, as it moved on through other philosophers, what Immanuel Kant believed, what Friedrich Nietzsche believed, it completely pushed out the spiritual elements, because as soon as you bring in a lot of spiritual elements, one of the key things is you have to admit that you are not the center of the universe, because there are other beings that are around us. We interact with these other spiritual beings all the time. It's called our family, our work colleagues. These people have their own autonomy. They're not NPCs, to put it in gaming terminology. But if you have a materialistic worldview, you end up treating people as if they're all NPCs.
NPC is a non-playable character. It means it's the computer, essentially. Now, if you put yourself at the center of the universe, that isn't putting man at the center of the universe. That's putting yourself as an individual.
Correct.
And that is a big reason why things would fall down, because if everybody puts themselves at the center of the universe, all it does is foster an environment of selfishness.
And narcissism. You'll end up with narcissists.
And a lack of honorableness and...
Yes, because you're only making decisions that suit you. You're never going to make a hard decision to do the right thing, because that doesn't benefit you. If you're completely materialist, you're only concerned about your own material well-being, and there's really no reason logically to act with classic morality, especially if it will cost you.
This is interesting because it plays into the reasons why STEM subjects, so science, technology, engineering,
mathematics,
are the most sought after and encouraged subjects in our higher learning institutions. And the subjects that used to be come under the heading of humanities, which was literally to learn how to be a human,
yes,
are looked down upon.
Yes, because in a materialistic world, you will look at those two options and you're going to look at it from a framework of value. What has the most value? And that not only value in a broad sense, but value in a narrow sense. There's a joke about a father that has a son that wants to study philosophy at university. And he sits the son down, and the father's not too pleased about this. And he sits the son down and says, "Son, do you know the difference between a doctorate in philosophy and a pizza?" And the son's like, "Dad, come on. What do you... No, son. What is the difference between a doctorate in philosophy and a pizza?" "What, Dad? What?" "A pizza will feed a family of 4. And that kind of epitomizes this materialistic way of looking at things, that will only do something if there's going to be some sort of payback later on down the track. So you'll do a STEM subject because you're going to get some sort of payback in terms of a good career later on, whereas people will look at the humanities and go, well, they often do, and they'll say, well, what are you going to do with that?
Interestingly enough, that is, in the classical world, you would educate a slave for a job.
Yes.
And you would educate a free man simply for knowledge's sake.
Yes.
So this whole idea of only doing subjects or learning things that are going to have financial payback is a slave mentality.
And I think it also leads to a lot of unintended consequences, one of which is that people are constantly wondering why we have such weak leaders that are not able to make wise decisions, and everyone is walking around tearing their hair out about so many silly decisions being made at all levels of our governments. And one of the reasons for that is that your average person hasn't paid attention to their general education, their humanities education, and therefore they don't have the tools or skills necessary to deal with moral or even just general questions when they arise in management.
Well, I think the thing with the humanities is they are teaching you of the liberal arts, shall we say. They teach you to be liberal, which is to be free, a better human being, and free from your baser instincts.
Yes.
And so,
not free to do whatever you want, free from your baser instincts.
Which basically means self-controlled.
Yes.
You gain self-controlled as you grow and as you learn and as you practice.
Yep.
And the thing is, if we don't value that process, then we're going to have people lacking in self-control, which is what you're talking about.
That's certainly one of the negatives of a materialistic worldview.
And people are also going to be acting because they're the center of the universe, selfishly, self-interestedly.
Yep.
And when everybody's doing that, it's to the detriment of society.
Yes, because what you end up with is take politicians as an example. They're going through their political career, and while they might be saying publicly all the right things, we know that, you know, former politicians always seem to find themselves plum jobs, whether it be, you know, in industry or overseas or with some NGO. And the reality, I mean, when I was a child, people used to say actions speak louder than words. I don't really care what they're saying. What happens in their career is that they make sure that they have a career advancement. They are looking after themselves, and therefore you have to ask, are they actually making decisions for their community and for the nation that are best for their community and for their nation, or are they simply trying to advance their career?
Well, they used to be public servant, but are no longer.
Yes.
So with materialism, focusing on the material, as well as meaning that you are self-centered and it creates a society where it's whatever you can get away with and every man for himself sort of thing, as well as that, it doesn't take into account the fact that there are things of great value that don't have a dollar amount attached to them.
Correct. If you have a materialistic framework, you will only value that which fits your definition of value. So a classic example there would be the economics or philosophy of utilitarianism. So this goes back to the 18th century. A guy, Jeremy Bentham, developed this way of thinking called utilitarianism. It was really an economic theory. And what he was trying to do is he was trying to make pleasure calculable. So if everything's material, then everything can be understood by mathematics and science. So he was trying to understand economics by mathematics and science. People make their decisions based on what they want, and he equated that with, or the motivation for that was that people were trying to maximize their pleasure. Therefore, if you want to calculate economics, you have to calculate pleasure, because that's what people are making their decisions based upon.
What was his definition of pleasure?
Utility. And utility is linked very closely to usefulness. So his idea of pleasure was really something that is of use to the individual, that is a means into the ends of getting what that individual wants.
So his idea of pleasure is, or definition of pleasure is, selfish enjoyment.
Yes.
So as a society, we need to be aware that there is this very vast underpinning of materialism that we have been taught, and we need to be aware that it is there, and that there is more to life and more to a successful culture and society than mere dollars and cents and material things that you can hold in your hand.
Correct. The materialism has been the ocean we've been swimming in. It's been the matrix we've been living in.
And once we get the idea of materialism as a concept, we can start seeing the value of things that don't have an economic value, but that do contribute positively to our lives, to the
Correct.
lives of those around us, and to then the wider society and community. It's reached such a fever pitch, this things will only have value if they have a dollar amount attached to them, that our society is suffering from a lack of volunteerism.
Yes.
People are only interested in doing something if they're going to get paid for it.
Correct.
And the other thing I think is, well, a big one is what happens with the stay-at-home parent, is that
if they're not earning a wage, if you don't put a dollar value on that which they are doing, therefore society considers it worthless. And in fact, it used to be one of my sayings. I now repudiate the saying, but when I was going through university, I was studying environmental sciences, and most of the people I was dealing with were left-wing. One of the things I'd say to them to sort of debate with them would be, if you say something is priceless, it's like saying it's worthless, because if you can't put a price on it, then it won't get valued. And I've come to realize that that was an incorrect way of looking at it, because it's materialistic. It doesn't allow for the immaterial values that people get out of, in this case, the environment around us. So,
well, it's a case of being part, swimming in the ocean and not seeing.
Yeah, I mean, that sort of example, it's a case of how do you put a value on a nice rural outlook, or a nice park, or the scent of a flower. They are simply things that you can enjoy at the time, but it has actually no correlation with your bank balance, or whether or not it's an efficient process, or whether or not you understand how a rose happens to be red and what that pigment is, because that's focusing in on the material. As soon as you start trying to analyze the rose instead of simply smelling it.
Is an experience a material thing?
Well, a materialist would say that, because a materialist would say that you experience the world through your five senses and that's it. So how then would a materialist talk about contemplation? Or,
well, I would argue that it's not, because yes, you experience through your five senses, but it's the story you tell yourself, the self-talk and how you think about it, that actually creates the enjoyment and the memory.
John Lennox has a great example of that is linked to this, in that, he will debate a lot, or does debate a lot, with people of a materialist background, and they, especially evolutionary biologists, and they will try and say that everything can be explained in material terms. And he tells the story of having one of these conversations, sitting at a dining table, and it was a set menu type thing at one of the universities. It was either Oxford or Cambridge. He's in Oxford, okay, in one of the colleges. And he said, well, can you explain the menu then? How do you understand that meaning of those words? How can you explain that by evolutionary biology or by science? And it stumped them. And it always does, because there is meaning and value in the written, spoken, even mentally pictured words. So how do you put a value on that?
When you start thinking about it, really considering it and talking about all of the implications, it actually becomes an impossible philosophy to subscribe to.
I think this contributes a lot to the mental health issues that we see around the place, because what you end up is that people
are doing mental gymnastics.
People are doing mental gymnastics all the time, and there's this concept of cognitive dissonance.
Yes.
We're trying to hold two contradictory ideas in your head at the same time.
But is that a reason why cognitive dissonance is so prevalent nowadays? Is because people have had to do it for so long. Now it's becoming second nature, so they don't see it when it's becoming idiocy.
Yes, people are not seeing the glaring mistakes, and it's really at a base level that people aren't seeing the glaring obvious mistakes. And the thing is, I was listening to a philosopher that teaches on postmodernism, and he was saying that the problem's even greater within academia, because the more intelligent people are, the more complicated mental gymnastics they can perform in order to convince themselves that something that is incoherent is actually coherent.
So really, this is an encouragement to be aware of materialism as a philosophy. If you're aware of it, then you can use it constructively to your advantage, knowing what it means and looking at the world around you from a more knowledgeable perspective.
Absolutely. I would summarize it as saying, once people become aware of the influence that these philosophies through time have had on us, we can investigate it and we can look at it. And as Socrates said, an unexamined life is not worth living.
Thank you for joining us for this Considered Opinions podcast. We look forward to seeing you again next time. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe.